In 1860, a woman in rural Alabama owned property worth over $300,000. That made her wealthier than 90% of all slaveholders in one of the richest cotton states in America. Her name was Louisa Harrison, and the 186 human beings she held in bondage represented both the foundation of her fortune and the moral bankruptcy of an entire society built on forced labor. Louisa McKinley Collins was born in 1817 in Edenton, North Carolina, into one of the wealthiest plantation families in the American South. Her father, Josiah Collins II, controlled Somerset Place, a vast estate near Lake Phelps that would eventually grow to encompass over 100,000 acres. Somerset Place was no ordinary plantation. It was one of the 3 largest slaveholding operations in North Carolina, with more than 300 enslaved people working its fields by the time of the Civil War. The Collins family had built this empire starting in the 1780s, when Louisa's grandfather, Josiah Collins I, arrived from Somerset County, England. He initially settled in Halifax, North Carolina, during the American Revolution, establishing himself as a merchant trading tobacco, sugar, molasses, and rum across networks that stretched to Europe, the West Indies, the Mediterranean, and Asia. In 1785, Collins joined 2 partners to form the Lake Company, purchasing over 100,000 acres of swampland around Lake Phelps. By 1790, the Lake Company owned 113 enslaved people who were forced to dig drainage ditches and clear the dense forest to create farmable land. The work was brutal beyond measure. Enslaved people labored in swampy conditions that bred disease. They cut through miles of thick forest, dug a 6-mile canal, and transformed wilderness into rice fields. Many died in the process. When rice cultivation proved too hazardous to enslaved workers' health, reducing their economic value, the Collins family switched to corn production. The decision had nothing to do with humanitarian concern and everything to do with protecting their investment in human property. Growing up at Somerset Place, young Louisa witnessed the machinery of slavery from the perspective of privilege. While hundreds of enslaved people cleared drainage ditches, planted crops, and maintained the extensive infrastructure of the plantation, she received the education typical of her class. Private tutors and a governess taught her at home during her childhood, instructing her in subjects considered appropriate for wealthy white women. Then, following the pattern of elite Southern families seeking to polish their daughters, she was sent north to attend a girls' boarding school in New York City. She spent 7 years there, far removed from the cotton fields and slave quarters that generated her family's wealth. This education shaped Louisa into an articulate, well-read woman who moved comfortably in elite social circles. She learned music, literature, and refined manners. But her education also included something else, something never formally taught but deeply absorbed. She learned to see enslaved people as property, as investments to be managed rather than human beings to be respected. She learned that her comfort, her education, her entire way of life depended on the subjugation of black men, women, and children who had no choice in the matter. When Josiah Collins II died in 1839, his will divided his estate among his 8 children. Louisa inherited a portion of that wealth, which included enslaved people. The forced separation of families was common in such divisions of property. People who had built lives and relationships at Somerset Place suddenly found themselves torn apart and distributed among various heirs like furniture or livestock. Some were sent to Edenton, others to Elizabeth City, and still others would eventually make the long journey to Alabama. Around 1842, Louisa met Thomas Alexander Harrison, a doctor from Virginia who was also from a slave-owning family. Harrison came from Charles City County, and like many ambitious young men from the Upper South in that era, he saw opportunity in the newly opened lands of Alabama. The state was experiencing what historians call Alabama fever, a rush of settlers eager to claim fertile soil in what was then the southwestern frontier of the Cotton Kingdom. Thomas Harrison had a medical degree, which was respectable but not particularly lucrative at the time. He needed capital, and he needed land. Louisa Collins brought both. Their courtship followed the customs of their class. In July 1842, Harrison presented Louisa with an engagement bracelet bearing his picture. She accepted, and they married. The union joined two plantation fortunes and set in motion a migration that would tear dozens of families apart. As part of her dowry, Louisa brought approximately 50 enslaved people from her family's holdings in North Carolina. Under the laws of the time, these people legally became the property of her husband upon marriage. Women in that era could not own property independently once wed, a detail of Victorian law that Louisa herself benefited from, even as it technically subordinated her to her husband. In 1843, Thomas Harrison traveled to Alabama ahead of his new wife. He was accompanied by the enslaved people from Louisa's dowry, people who had been forcibly marched hundreds of miles from North Carolina to Alabama. These individuals had to leave behind friends, relatives, and everything familiar. The journey itself was traumatic, but the destination would prove equally harsh. Harrison purchased 960 acres in Marengo County from a landowner named Henry Augustine Taylor. The land cost $17,000 and included a small two-room log cabin built by a man named Bird Pearson. This would become the foundation of Faunsdale Plantation. Harrison named the estate Faunsdale after Faunus, the ancient Roman deity of the forest, plains, and fields. It was a classical reference typical of educated Southern gentlemen who liked to see themselves as inheritors of Roman and Greek traditions, conveniently ignoring that those ancient civilizations were also built on slavery. The name reflected Harrison's pretensions to culture, but the reality of the place was far less romantic than mythology suggested. Louisa joined her husband in 1844, and they immediately began expanding the operation. The small log cabin was extensively remodeled and expanded into a Greek Revival-style house with 2 stories and flanking wings. The design resembled 3-part Palladian structures from the Tidewater region of Virginia and North Carolina, connecting their new Alabama estate to the architectural traditions of the Upper South they had left behind. Around this main house, they constructed all the buildings necessary for running a large plantation worked by forced labor. There were barns for storing cotton, storage buildings for equipment and supplies, workshops where enslaved artisans produced goods, and, of course, the slave quarters where the people who made everything possible were housed in structures deliberately built to be temporary and uncomfortable. Cotton was the primary crop at Faunsdale, as it was throughout Alabama's Black Belt. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing the fiber that fed the textile mills in New England and England. Cotton cultivation was labor-intensive work that required year-round attention. Enslaved workers cleared land, plowed fields, planted seeds, chopped weeds through the hot summer months, and finally picked the cotton when bolls opened in the fall. A skilled picker might harvest 200 pounds in a day, working from dawn until dusk with only brief breaks. Children as young as 6 or 7 were put to work carrying water to field hands, or picking alongside adults once they were tall enough to reach the plants. The Harrisons quickly established themselves as a part of the planter elite in Marengo County. They were devout Episcopalians, and in 1844 they donated 1 acre of their plantation for the construction of a log church across from their house. This would eventually become St. Michael's Episcopal Church. In 1846, Alabama's first Episcopal bishop, Nicholas Hamner Cobbs, visited Fonsdale Plantation. He later wrote that Louisa Harrison gave regular instruction to the enslaved people by reading church services to them and teaching the catechism to their children. This religious instruction was typical of many slaveholding families who genuinely believed they were saving the souls of the people they enslaved. Louisa apparently took this duty seriously, but the Christianity she taught was carefully selected to emphasize obedience, submission, and accepting one's lot in life. The gospel message of liberation and justice was conspicuously absent from these lessons. Instead, enslaved people heard passages about servants obeying their masters and enduring suffering as Christ did. The chapel that Louisa later built specifically for enslaved workers became a tool of control as much as a place of worship. The plantation grew rapidly. Records indicate that by 1846, just a few years after establishing Fonsdale, the Harrisons held approximately 99 enslaved people. The federal census of 1850 listed Thomas Harrison as owning property valued at $18,300, a figure based mostly on the assessed value of the human beings he claimed to own. People were assets on a balance sheet, their worth calculated like that of livestock or equipment. By 1857, the number of enslaved people at Fonsdale had grown to 161. Some of this increase came through natural population growth, as enslaved people had children who were automatically born into bondage. The Harrisons also purchased additional people as their cotton operation expanded. Thomas Harrison insisted on strict protocols that reinforced the power dynamics. Enslaved men were required to raise their hats when they encountered him, and enslaved women had to curtsy. These rituals of submission were designed to constantly remind everyone of the social hierarchy built on racial oppression. The plantation itself expanded as well. Harrison acquired an additional 340 acres, bringing the total to 1,200 acres. About 1855, he purchased land in Louisiana near the Mississippi River. The bottomland there was covered with dense undergrowth and trees, and Harrison sent a work party of enslaved people to begin clearing it for cultivation. This secondary operation in Louisiana added another layer to the Harrisons' cotton empire. But prosperity and mortality often intersect in unexpected ways. On September 5, 1858, Thomas Harrison died in what contemporary accounts describe as a buggy accident. He was coming home from a social gathering when his carriage overturned. The injury wasn't immediately fatal, but he lingered for several weeks in considerable pain before dying. He was only 44 years old. He was buried in the churchyard at St. Michael's, becoming the first person interred there. The nearby town would later be named Fonsdale in his honor when the railroad came through in 1862. But the immediate concern was what would happen to the plantation. Thomas Harrison's will did something unusual for the time. Instead of leaving the estate to a male relative, he left it to his widow, Louisa. Women rarely inherited and managed large plantations independently. The expectation was that estates would pass to brothers, sons, or other male family members. But Harrison trusted his wife with the operation, perhaps recognizing her, business acumen, or perhaps simply having no better alternative since they had only one child, a daughter named Louise. At 31 years old, Louisa Harrison found herself in control of one of the largest slaveholding operations in Alabama. The 1860 census reveals the extent of her wealth. She was listed as owning 125 enslaved people and holding property and real estate valued at $332,162. To put that in perspective, this placed her in the top 10% of all slaveholders in Alabama in terms of wealth. In an era when a skilled worker might earn $1 a day, Louisa Harrison controlled a fortune worth hundreds of thousands. She managed this empire during some of the most turbulent years in American history. The 1860s brought the Secession Crisis, the Civil War, and ultimately the end of slavery. But before the war, Louisa continued operating Fonsdale as her husband had, supervising the cultivation of cotton using forced labor. This was no passive inheritance. She made decisions about crop rotations, supervised overseers, purchased supplies, sold cotton, and handled all the business affairs of a major agricultural operation. She corresponded with factors in Mobile who marketed her cotton. She arranged for the purchase of additional enslaved people when labor needs demanded it. She dealt with merchants who supplied the plantation with tools, cloth, food items that couldn't be produced on site, and luxury goods for the main house. The daily operations of the plantation required constant oversight. Field hands needed to be assigned to specific tasks. The cotton gin needed maintenance. Supplies had to be distributed. Discipline had to be enforced. Louisa handled all of this, making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people who had no say in their own futures. She embodied the reality that women were not simply passive beneficiaries of slavery, but active participants in managing and perpetuating the system. She kept detailed records, more detailed than many plantation owners. A list from January 1st, 1864, shows that she enslaved 186 people who comprised at least 35 families. What makes these records particularly valuable to historians is that Louisa's documentation included the surnames that enslaved families used among themselves. Most plantation records only listed first names, treating enslaved people as interchangeable units of labor. But Louisa's records noted surnames like Barron, Brown, Francis, Harrison, Iredell, Mutton, Nathan, Newbern, Payne, Parsons, Richmond, Washington, and Wills. Some enslaved people even took the surname Harrison, possibly indicating family connections through sexual exploitation by white slaveholders, possibly indicating adoption of their owner's name, or possibly for reasons we can only speculate about. These families lived in the slave quarters that still partially survive at Fonsdale today. They are among the most significant examples of slave housing remaining in Marengo County and among the last in Alabama. The wooden structures, dating from around 1860, have high-pitched gables and scalloped barge boards showing a Carpenter Gothic influence. They were built, like the Gothic Revival Church, likely by enslaved artisans. Two men named Peter Lee and Joe Glasgow are documented as the enslaved craftsmen who constructed the church building in 1855. Life in these quarters was difficult beyond measure. By the end of 1864, 14 of the enslaved people at Fonsdale had died from infectious diseases. The mortality list is preserved in plantation records, a grim catalog of preventable deaths. Granville, age 44, died of pneumonia on January 2nd. Linda, age 48, died of pneumonia on April 2nd. 8-year-old George died of diphtheria on August 31st. 16-year-old Anne died of typhoid fever on September 1st. Then came Bryant, age 1, from diphtheria on September 26th, and Wellington, age 2, from diphtheria on September 27th. Serena, 15 years old, died of typhoid on October 10th. 1-year-old Virginia succumbed to diphtheria on October 26th. 13-year-old Sophie died of typhoid on October 31st. Ruth, 42, died of typhoid on November 14th. Amy, just 14, died of typhoid on November 22nd. 37-year-old Jupiter died of typhoid on December 15th. 27-year-old Ashbury died of meningitis on December 19th. And finally, 1-year-old Thompson died of diphtheria on December 22nd. 14 deaths in 1 year from preventable diseases. The concentration of cases in September through December suggests epidemic conditions, possibly related to contaminated water sources or inadequate sanitation in the slave quarters. These deaths represented not just tragedy for the families involved, but also financial loss for Louisa Harrison, who viewed these human beings primarily as economic assets. The cold calculus of slavery meant that every death represented diminished property value. During this period, Louisa also continued her role as religious instructor to the enslaved community. After her husband's death, she had built a chapel on the plantation grounds specifically for enslaved workers. Other plantation owners in the area followed her example. The widow, Mrs. McRae at Athol Plantation, built a slave chapel, as did Mr. Bocock at Waldwick Plantation and Mr. Terrell at Brame Plantation. These chapels served multiple purposes. They were genuine expressions of religious belief by owners who thought they were doing God's work. They were also mechanisms of social control, teaching enslaved people that their suffering had divine sanction and that their reward would come in the afterlife rather than in freedom during their earthly lives. In 1863 or 1864, Louisa married again. Her second husband was Reverend William Augustus Stickney, the Episcopal minister who served at St. Michael's. Stickney was born in Greensboro, Alabama in 1824, and had been ordained by Bishop Cobbs in 1847. He had served at parishes in Marion and other parts of Alabama before coming to Faunsdale. In 1863, Bishop Richard Wilmer appointed Stickney as a missionary to the Negroes, a position focused on religious instruction and conversion of enslaved people and later freedmen in the Black Belt region. The marriage between Louisa and William Stickney created an unusual partnership. She brought wealth and property. He brought religious authority and standing in the Episcopal Church. Together they continued managing Faunsdale Plantation through the tumultuous years of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Under the laws of coverture that still governed married women's property, William Stickney technically gained legal control of the estate when he married Louisa, though she remained actively involved in its management. The Civil War came to Alabama with devastating effect. While the plantation wasn't directly in the path of major battles, the conflict disrupted the entire Southern economy. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly. The Confederate government impressed supplies and labor. Confederate soldiers needed food, equipment, and horses, which were taken from plantations often with promises of payment that never materialized. And increasingly, enslaved people saw the approach of Union forces as an opportunity for freedom. Some left plantations to seek Union lines. Others remained but performed their labor with growing resistance and reduced productivity, knowing that the system holding them in bondage was crumbling. As a loyal supporter of the Confederacy, Louisa and her second husband, William Stickney, did what they could to support the Southern cause. They provided supplies when requested. They maintained agricultural production to feed the war effort. But, like plantation owners throughout the South, they watched their world falling apart. The currency they held became worthless as Confederate money collapsed. The enslaved people they had counted on as permanent assets were slipping away toward freedom. When Union troops finally came through Marengo County in 1865, they brought with them the Emancipation Proclamation's promise of freedom. Technically, slavery ended, but the Stickneys, like many Southern landowners, immediately moved to recreate the old power structure under different names. They couldn't afford to pay real wages to the newly freed people, but they also still viewed them as their property and wanted to maintain control. So they offered labor contracts. These contracts were little better than slavery. Freedmen signed agreements to work the land for a share of the crop, but the terms were heavily weighted in favor of the landowner. Workers often ended up in debt at the plantation store, trapped in a cycle of peonage that kept them tied to the land almost as effectively as slavery had. The Stickneys' correspondence from the late 1860s and early 1870s references the signing of yearly labor contracts and the daily management of these arrangements. Workers who resisted or tried to leave could be prosecuted under vagrancy laws or contract enforcement statutes that gave legal sanction to forced labor under a different name. The system was designed to extract as much labor as possible while providing as little compensation as legally permissible. Freedmen were charged for housing in the same cabins they had occupied as enslaved people. They were charged for food at inflated prices at the plantation store. They were docked pay for any perceived infractions. At the end of the season, after expenses were tallied, workers often found themselves deeper in debt rather than ahead. This debt bondage kept many formerly enslaved people and their children tied to plantations well into the 20th century. Louisa actively participated in this system. She joined her husband in his missionary work among African Americans in the region, teaching Christianity, but also promoting a social order that kept formerly enslaved people in subordinate positions. Her religious instruction continued, now framed as helping freedmen adjust to their new status, but still emphasizing obedience, hard work for white landowners, and acceptance of social hierarchies. The economic challenges of the post-war South caught up with the Stickneys, as they did with many former slaveholders. By 1894, Fonsdale was facing foreclosure. A law firm informed Reverend Stickney that a mortgage on the property was being called in, and the plantation would be sold at public auction. The mortgage was extended temporarily, but the financial pressures remained. The Stickneys were land-rich but cash-poor, possessing extensive property that no longer generated the wealth it once had when worked by unpaid labor. Louisa Harrison Stickney died in 1896. She was 79 years old. Letters of sympathy to Reverend Stickney are preserved in plantation records, expressions of condolence from friends and family. She had lived through the height of the plantation system, the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the difficult decades of Reconstruction and its aftermath. She died still owning Fonsdale, though it was much diminished from its antebellum glory. Reverend Stickney outlived her by 12 years, dying in 1908 at age 84. He continued serving as an Episcopal minister in various Alabama parishes until near the end of his life. The plantation passed to other family members, including Louisa's daughter Louise Collins Harrison, who had married her cousin William Blount Shepherd of Edenton, North Carolina, creating another link back to the Collins families. North Carolina roots. The story of Louisa Harrison poses uncomfortable questions about complicity, about the role of women in maintaining slavery, and about how education and refinement coexisted with participation in profound injustice. Louisa was not an aberration. She was typical of wealthy white Southern women who benefited from and actively upheld the slave system. She was educated, religious, and by all accounts took her duties seriously. She kept detailed records, provided religious instruction, and managed her property efficiently. None of these qualities made her actions moral or defensible. The detailed records she kept, which now seem valuable to historians seeking to document the lives of enslaved people, were not maintained out of humanitarian concern. They were business records tracking valuable assets. When she noted surnames and family relationships, it was useful information for managing her property, not an expression of recognition of these people's full humanity. The chapel she built for enslaved workers was meant to make them better slaves, not to liberate them. At the same time, those records do allow us to recover some information about the people she enslaved. We know their names now, at least some of them. We know about the surnames they used among themselves. We know about the families they formed despite the conditions of their bondage. People like the Barron family, the Brown family, the Francis family, the Harrison family with their variant spelling. These people built communities, maintained relationships, and resisted in ways both large and small the system that sought to dehumanize them. The mortality records from 1864 tell us about specific individuals whose lives were cut short by disease that better living conditions might have prevented. 14-year-old Amy, who died of typhoid. 1-year-old Thompson, who died of diphtheria. These weren't just statistics in a ledger book. They were human beings whose deaths devastated their families and communities. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people from Faunsdale remained in the area, though they left the plantation itself when they could. Some of their descendants still live in Alabama today. Freed person marriage records show names like Gregory Adams marrying Penelope Stickney in 1867, Isom Weaver marrying Callista Stickney that same year, and Ned Fortune marrying Caroline Stickney in 1866. The surname Stickney appearing in these records suggests that some formerly enslaved people took their former owner's name, while others maintained the surnames they had used during slavery. The physical remains of Faunsdale Plantation tell their own story. The main house still stands, owned by descendants of the Harrison family. Some of the slave quarters survive as well, haunting reminders of the people who lived and worked there. The churchyard at St. Michael's contains graves of both the Planter family and, formerly, enslaved people who were buried there, starting in 1860. The church building itself was moved to the town of Faunsdale in 1888 and was destroyed by a tornado in 1932, but the cemetery remains. In 1993, Faunsdale Plantation was added to the National Register of Historic Places as part of a multiple property submission documenting plantation houses of the Alabama canebrake. The significance of the site lies partly in the architectural features of the main house and outbuildings, but more importantly, in the survival of slave quarters that document the living conditions of enslaved people. These structures are rare survivors. Most slave housing was poorly built and deliberately constructed to be temporary, reflecting the planters' view of enslaved people as disposable. That any remain at all is remarkable. Today, Faunsdale Plantation exists as a historical site that raises fundamental questions about how we remember the past. The plantation economy made Alabama one of the wealthiest states in the nation before the Civil War, but that wealth came entirely from stolen labor. Women like Louisa Harrison were full participants in this system. They weren't innocent bystanders or reluctant participants. They actively managed enslaved people, made decisions about their lives and labor, and profited directly from their exploitation. The question of how we understand figures like Louisa Harrison is complicated by the fact that she was in many ways typical of her time and place. Thousands of white women in the South owned enslaved people. They supervised household workers, managed plantation operations in their husbands' absence, and passed their property and human beings to their children. Many were deeply religious, genuinely believing that slavery was sanctioned by God, and that they were acting righteously by providing religious instruction to the people they enslaved. But the typicality of such behavior doesn't make it less wrong. The fact that Louisa Harrison was acting according to the norms of her society doesn't absolve her of responsibility for participating in a system of brutal oppression. She had choices, even if those choices were constrained by the expectations of her gender and class. She could have freed the people she inherited. She could have refused to participate in the plantation economy. Such actions would have been difficult and would have required tremendous moral courage. They would have meant giving up wealth and social standing. Very few people made those choices, but some did. The existence of white abolitionists and Quakers who freed their enslaved people demonstrates that alternatives were possible. Louisa Harrison chose to maintain and expand her slaveholding operation. She brought people from North Carolina to Alabama, tearing them away from their homes and families. She purchased additional enslaved people to grow her cotton empire. She managed the plantation through her widowhood and into her second marriage. She continued exploiting formerly enslaved people through labor contracts after emancipation. At every decision point, she chose profit and maintaining her position in society over recognizing the humanity of the people whose labor generated her wealth. The legacy of people like Louisa Harrison extends far beyond her own lifetime. The wealth she accumulated through slavery stayed in white families, passing down through generations while the people who actually created that wealth received nothing. Her daughter, Louise Harrison Shepherd, inherited property and social standing. Louisa's children grew up with advantages built on the labor of people who received no compensation for creating that wealth. This pattern repeated across thousands of white Southern families, creating intergenerational wealth that persisted while African American families started with nothing after emancipation. The descendants of the people she enslaved started with nothing after emancipation, facing discrimination, violence, and systematic exclusion from economic opportunity. They couldn't vote in many places due to poll taxes and literacy tests. They couldn't access quality education because schools were segregated, and black schools received a fraction of the funding white schools did. They couldn't buy property in many areas due to discriminatory lending practices and restrictive covenants. They faced violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan if they tried to assert their rights or achieve economic success. Every avenue to building wealth was blocked or made extraordinarily difficult. The wealth gap between white and black Americans today has its roots in this history, in the fact that enslaved people's labor created fortunes for white families, while they themselves were denied any compensation or opportunity to build intergenerational wealth. Studies have shown that the descendants of enslaved people have significantly lower wealth levels than descendants of free families, and that this gap persists across generations even when controlling for education and income. The head start that families like the Harrisons received through slavery continues to compound across time. The religious instruction that Louisa provided to enslaved people was part of a larger pattern of using Christianity to justify and maintain slavery. The version of Christianity taught in plantation chapels emphasized submission and suffering, stripping away the liberating message of the gospel. This created lasting damage to how many African Americans related to organized religion, and it represented a profound betrayal of Christian principles by white churches that accommodated themselves to slavery. The detailed records that Louisa kept serve a purpose today that she never intended. They allow historians and descendants to reconstruct something of the lives of enslaved people at Faunsdale. They provide names, family relationships, and some sense of the community that existed in the quarters. They document the mortality and suffering that was endemic to the slave system. They stand as evidence of what happened at places like Faunsdale and thousands of other plantations across the South. When we tell the story of Louisa Harrison, we're telling a story about how ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil. She wasn't a monster. She was a human being who was educated, cultured, and religious. She attended church regularly, read widely, and maintained correspondence with family and friends across the South. She was considered by those who knew her to be a refined lady of impeccable breeding and manners. She was also someone who held 186 human beings in bondage and saw nothing wrong with it. Both of these things are true, and the tension between them is important to acknowledge. The history of American slavery is not just about men like Thomas Jefferson or John C. Calhoun who articulated ideological defenses of the institution. It's also about people like Louisa Harrison, who simply participated in the system without apparent doubt or objection. It's about the women who managed households staffed by enslaved people, who supervised field work, who bought and sold human beings, and who taught their children that this was the natural order of things. Understanding this history requires looking at the full humanity of everyone involved. The people Louisa enslaved were human beings with names, families, hopes, and dreams. They built communities despite incredible hardship. They maintained cultural practices and family bonds that slavery tried to destroy. They survived, and many of their descendants thrive today, despite the obstacles that history placed in their path. Louisa Harrison was also a human being, capable of love and compassion, someone who cared about education and religion and her family. But she was also capable of participating in a system that treated other human beings as property. She benefited from immense wealth built on stolen labor. She made choices that caused suffering to hundreds of people whose names we mostly don't know. The fact that we know her name, that records of her life survive, while many of the people she enslaved remain anonymous, is itself part of the injustice. History has traditionally been written by and about people with power, people like Louisa Harrison, who left written records and whose property and achievements were documented. The people who actually built and worked Faunsdale, who planted and harvested the cotton, who constructed the buildings, who cooked the meals and raised the children. Their stories are much harder to recover. They left fewer documents, and the records that do exist were usually created by their oppressors. This is why sites like Faunsdale matter. The surviving slave quarters provide physical evidence of how enslaved people lived. The plantation records, despite being created to track property, preserve information about names and families. The cemetery where formerly enslaved people were buried beginning in 1860 serves as a memorial to lives that deserved to be remembered. These fragments allow us to piece together something of what happened here, to honor the memory of people whose humanity was denied, but who remained human nonetheless. The story of Louisa Harrison and Fonsdale Plantation is ultimately a story about choices and consequences. Louisa chose to participate fully in the slave system. She profited enormously from that choice. But the consequences extended far beyond her own enrichment. Hundreds of people suffered because of the institution she upheld. Families were separated. People died from preventable diseases because adequate resources weren't devoted to their health and welfare. Human potential was crushed under the weight of bondage. Those consequences continue to echo through American society today. The racial wealth gap, residential segregation, disparities in health and education, all have roots that reach back to slavery and its aftermath. The choices that people like Louisa Harrison made in the 19th century shaped the opportunities available to their descendants and to the descendants of the people they enslaved. Understanding that history, facing it honestly without flinching or making excuses, is necessary if we're to make different choices going forward. Louisa McKinley Collins. Harrison Stickney died in 1896, wealthy by the standards of her time, comfortable in her beliefs, surrounded by family. She was mourned by people who loved her and respected her. But the measure of a life shouldn't be only how one is viewed by friends and family. It should also include how one's actions affected people who had no choice in the matter, people who were vulnerable and oppressed. By that measure, Louisa Harrison's life represents a profound moral failure. A failure she shared with thousands of others in her society, but a failure nonetheless. The people she enslaved, whose names we know only fragmentarily through records meant to track property, they were the ones who deserved comfort and respect and the opportunity to live freely. Some of them found freedom in 1865 and built lives for themselves and their descendants despite incredible obstacles. Others died in bondage, their potential unfulfilled, their lives cut short. All of them deserved better than what they received at Fonsdale Plantation under the management of Louisa Harrison. Their story and hers remain part of American history, uncomfortable reminders of the moral compromises that built this nation's wealth and the human cost of those compromises. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we remember it and how we allow that memory to inform our present choices. The detailed records from Fonsdale, the surviving buildings, the names in the church register and the cemetery. All of these fragments of evidence demand that we remember fully and honestly. They demand that we acknowledge both the enslaved people who suffered and the enslavers who profited. They demand that we face the uncomfortable truth that education, religion, and gentility were perfectly compatible with participation in slavery. And they demand that we grapple with the ongoing legacy of choices made more than a century ago, choices whose consequences we still live with today.